house in flames, a family shattered, and 5 children who disappeared without a trace. On a quiet Christmas Eve in 1945, a fire tore through the Everly family home, taking with it everything, except for the 5 children. As fire trucks arrived, the blaze had already claimed the house. But there was something far more disturbing than the charred remains of the house. There were no remains of the children, no bodies, no clues, no sign that they had even been inside when the fire started. What really happened that night? The mystery of the Everly children has haunted the town of Ellsworth for decades, the kind of haunting that refuses to leave, lingering in every whisper and every shadow. Investigators looked for answers, but with every lead, they only uncovered more questions. And as time passed, more strange occurrences unfolded, leaving the community in a state of unease. For years, the town spoke of the fire in hushed tones, each version of events darker than the last. Was it really just a tragic accident? Or was there something more? What if the fire wasn't an accident? What if someone close, had orchestrated the tragedy? Or what if something more dangerous, more unsettling, was at play that night? To this day, the truth behind the Everly children's disappearance remains hidden, leaving only shadows of doubt and unanswered questions. In the weeks following the fire, investigators were stumped. The fire department, despite their best efforts, could find no trace of the children inside the wreckage. Their rooms had been untouched by the flames, and outside, not a single piece of evidence that could explain where they went. Was it possible that the fire was a cover-up, or perhaps a sign of something darker? As authorities continue to search for answers, the possibility of foul play lingers. Was it someone close to the family? Or was it someone or something more mysterious? And as the years go by, the strange sightings around the old Everly house continue. People report hearing eerie sounds, lights flickering on and off in the middle of the night, and shadows moving through the windows. Could it be the children, forever trapped between two worlds? Or is there something else watching over the land, something beyond our understanding? The disappearance of the Everly children is more than a tragedy. It's a puzzle that continues to captivate, a question that refuses to be answered. And the truth, whatever it is, may be more unsettling than we could ever imagine. The Everly family had once been the epitome of peace and happiness in the quiet town of Ellsworth, nestled deep in the rolling hills of rural New England. Jonathan, a hard-working farmer, and his wife Rose, a loving homemaker, had built a life that many envied. Their 5 children, Sarah, Thomas, Emily, Jacob, and Lily, were the heartbeat of their home, a place filled with laughter, warmth, and the simplicity of a close-knit family. But all of that vanished on one cold Christmas Eve in 1945. The fire started just after midnight. At first it was just a spark, a flicker of orange light against the dark winter sky. But by the time the fire trucks arrived, the Everly house was nothing but a raging inferno, its flames reaching up as though trying to claw at the stars themselves. Neighbors rushed to the scene, their faces pale with fear, their hearts pounding in their chests. They watched helplessly as the fire devoured the home. Jonathan and Rose had barely escaped, their clothes singed, their skin raw from the heat. But their children, their 5 children, were nowhere to be found. The fire department sifted through the rubble, but there were no bodies, no remains, not even a trace of their existence inside. It didn't make sense. If the children had been inside, if they had perished in the flames, there should have been something, anything, to prove it. But nothing. Not a single piece of evidence that they were there. The investigation turned up nothing. The fire had been intense, yes, but the authorities were certain that the children had been home when it started. And yet no one could find a reason why they hadn't been caught in the fire. No sign of struggle, No sign of movement. It was as if they had disappeared into thin air. Then, as the weeks passed, strange things began to happen. People reported hearing the soft echo of children's laughter in the woods behind the burned house. At first, it was dismissed as grief-stricken imagination. Surely the families who had lost so much were simply hearing things in their sorrow. But the sounds were consistent, eerie, too clear to be a mere figment of the mind. Some claimed to have seen figures moving in the distance, shadowy shapes near the tree line, barely visible, yet unmistakably human. The police combed the area. They found nothing, but the strange occurrences only grew. One evening, a local woman named Edith Swan was walking her dog near the edge of the woods when she stopped dead in her tracks. The dog, usually so obedient, had suddenly frozen, growling at the trees. It was then that Edith heard it. A voice, a whisper. But it wasn't the wind. No, this voice was unmistakable, calling out faintly, as if someone was trying to get her attention. "Help us." She bolted back to town, terrified. The next day, she told anyone who would listen, but no one believed her. Not at first, but others had similar experiences, as if the past, something buried deep within the earth of that very land, refused to stay buried. Could it be the children? Had they really perished in the fire, or was something far darker at play? Something that the town had yet to uncover. Days turned into weeks, and still no answers. Rose and Jonathan Everly couldn't bring themselves to speak of it. Their grief was consuming. The thought of their children, possibly still out there alive, but trapped somewhere they couldn't reach, tormented them. But the silence that hung over them was like a weight they couldn't escape. The guilt gnawed at them. Had they missed something? Had they done something wrong? But they were not alone in their torment. One night, a local historian named Michael Grant ventured to the ruins of the Everly house, hoping to piece together something that had eluded everyone else. A clue, a sign, anything. He had studied the town's history for years and had uncovered strange stories about that very land. Stories of families that had vanished without a trace. Entire households lost in unexplained circumstances. As he stood at the remnants of the house, staring at the blackened beams, he felt a chill crawl up his spine. There, in the distance, just beyond the charred remains, he thought he saw something, a flicker of movement. Then, the faintest whisper, just like Edith had described. The wind, or something else. His heart pounded. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Was this a message? A call for help? Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. Was this the work of a broken mind? Or was there something, someone, still out there? Something that didn't want the town to forget what happened. Something that wanted to make sure the truth stayed hidden, locked away forever. Time continued to pass, and the mystery only deepened. Investigations went cold. But as whispers grew, so did the rumors. Could the fire have been more than just an accident? Could it have been deliberately set, not to destroy the Everly family, but to erase them completely? And if so, who would have wanted that? Were there others involved? Could one of their own have orchestrated this? Or were they simply the victims of an event far beyond their understanding? Something with an agenda of its own. One that would never allow the Everly family's dark secrets to be unearthed. As these thoughts lingered, one question began to rise above all others. Where did the Everly children go? And why has no one been able to find them? Stay with us, because the answers may be closer than you think, but they might not be the answers you want to hear. What do you believe happened to Sarah, Thomas, Emily, Jacob, and Lily? Could they still be alive? Or is there something even more terrifying waiting to be uncovered? And if the truth is finally revealed, what will that mean for the town of Ellsworth? Before the fire, the Everly family had seemed like the embodiment of the American dream. Jonathan, a rugged yet gentle man, spent his days working the land, his strong hands tending to the farm, with a sense of pride that matched the love he had for his children. Sarah, the oldest, was a bright girl with a love for reading, often found curled up on the porch with a book. Thomas, always the joker, would keep his siblings laughing with his wild ideas and antics. Emily, sweet and quiet, spent hours drawing, creating worlds that only she seemed to understand. Jacob and Lily, the youngest, filled the house with innocent chatter, their boundless energy a source of joy for everyone. Rose, Jonathan's wife, was the heart of the family, a mother who nurtured her children with an unwavering love, a woman whose presence could soothe even the most restless soul. She was always there, always ready to comfort her children when they needed it, always ready to share a laugh with Jonathan after a long day. Their home was a sanctuary of warmth and laughter, a place where all of them, parents and children, felt safe and loved. It was perfect, the kind of family every person dreams of. Then came that night. The fire tore through their home without warning, swallowing everything in its path. Jonathan and Rose had escaped, but their 5 children were trapped. They tried desperately to get back inside, but the flames were too intense, the heat too overwhelming. And by the time the fire was out, there was nothing left of their children. No sign of them in the wreckage, no remnants of their rooms, no small belongings left behind. Just a pile of ash, a broken home, and 2 parents who were left to grapple with an unbearable loss. But no matter how many times Rose tried to grasp the truth, it felt unreal. The thought of losing her children, her heart and soul, was something her mind simply couldn't accept. Jonathan, too, struggled, but Rose was hit the hardest. Her mind began to unravel, caught in a storm of grief, guilt, and confusion. Neighbors and friends, who once saw her as the picture of warmth and stability, now watched with pity and fear. Rose would wander the house, calling out for the children as though they had simply disappeared into another room. At night, she would stand at the window, staring out into the dark woods, her eyes hollow, her voice trembling as she whispered their names. "I know they're out there," she would murmur, though she never seemed to hear anyone who tried to talk sense into her. "I feel them, Jonathan. They're still here. They can't be gone." Jonathan was torn, watching his wife slowly slip away from him. He knew something had happened that night, something beyond the fire, something he couldn't explain, but the guilt was suffocating. Could he have done more to save them? Could he have gotten back into the house? His mind replayed that night over and over, each second becoming an endless loop of regret. He had saved his wife, but he couldn't save his children. It was a weight that hung heavy in his chest, and with every passing day, it grew worse. As the weeks turned to months, the townspeople began to turn on them, their whispers growing louder. At first it was subtle, a side glance here, a hushed conversation there. But as the days dragged on and the questions mounted, the accusations started to form. What really happened that night? Was the fire truly an accident? Or were the Everlys hiding something? Had they been responsible for their children's disappearance? And was the fire a cover-up for something darker? Some wondered if Jonathan had done something unspeakable, something that caused the fire. Others pointed to Rose's erratic behavior, her insistence that the children were still alive, still out there. The town, once a place of comfort, had turned against them, and in their isolation, the emotional toll on the Everlys only deepened. Jonathan wanted to believe that his children were still out there. Maybe they had somehow survived the fire and had been taken away for some reason. But the rational part of his mind told him it wasn't possible. No one could survive such a fire, not without leaving a trace. And yet every time he closed his eyes, he saw their faces, their smiling faces, so full of life. They had been taken from him, and now the guilt weighed on him too much to bear. He could feel his grip on reality slipping. Rose, on the other hand, couldn't let go. She couldn't bring herself to believe they were gone. Every day she wandered the house, her eyes scanning every corner for something, anything, that might prove her children were still with her. She would sit on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, staring into the distance, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Her grief had consumed her. She no longer knew where the boundary between reality and her twisted thoughts began. And all the while, the town watched. The investigators came and went, their visits becoming more routine than anything. The fire had been ruled an accident, but something didn't sit right. The reports from the fire department said that no human remains had been found, even though the blaze was hot enough to destroy almost everything. No traces of the children's clothing, no scraps of their favorite toys, not even a single bone. And yet, some insisted they were still out there. Rose's desperation became the talk of the town. Her outbursts and strange actions were seen as further proof that she knew something others didn't. The questions continued to swirl around them, choking the family with suspicion and dread. Were they the victims of an unexplainable tragedy, or had they been complicit in something unspeakable? Were they really just grieving parents, or were they hiding a darker truth? Every day, as the hours dragged on, their family's life became a twisted game of waiting. Waiting for an answer, waiting for a sign, waiting for the children to come home. The truth, whatever it was, had become more elusive, more impossible to reach. The fire was officially deemed an accident, nothing more than a tragic mishap that claimed the lives of 5 innocent children. The authorities had no answers, only empty reports and a handful of assumptions. But as the weeks passed, the absence of any human remains from the fire began to raise serious questions. How could it be? How could such a catastrophic blaze leave nothing behind? No charred fragments of clothing, no traces of bones, no remnants of the children at all. Experts claimed that the heat was so intense it could have turned everything to ash, but something didn't sit right. Was it truly possible for a fire to destroy every trace of human life, even in a home that had seemed so solid and real? Or was there something else at play here? Something the investigators overlooked, or chose not to see? A few townsfolk began to speculate about what had happened that night, and their theories painted an entirely different picture. Some believed the fire was set deliberately, but not in the way people thought. What if the house had been set ablaze to cover up something far worse? What if the children had been taken before the flames ever started? This theory circulated quietly at first, dismissed by most as pure paranoia. Yet as more details came to light, more and more people began to wonder. Was it possible that someone in the town knew more than they were letting on? Someone who had access to the Everly family's home? Someone who had a reason to take the children? But why? There were rumors, of course. Talk of strangers seen lurking near the Everly house in the days before the fire. A few whispers about a neighbor who'd been acting strangely, a man who'd recently moved to the area. But these whispers quickly faded, swallowed by the unrelenting weight of the tragedy. People wanted to believe it was just an accident, an unfortunate incident that would never be explained. But there were cracks in the story, cracks that couldn't be ignored. Then there was the other theory, the one that sent a chill through anyone who heard it. Some began to talk about the paranormal. There were reports of strange happenings at the Everly house, even after the fire. Neighbors said they heard footsteps in the night, too loud to be ignored, too steady to be a trick of the wind. Others spoke of lights flickering in the abandoned house, a soft glow visible through the charred windows in the dead of night. But the most unsettling of all were the sounds. A soft, rhythmic knocking, like a child's tiny fist tapping on the walls of the home. A voice, distant and faint, whispering names. At first it was dismissed as nothing more than grief-stricken hallucinations, brought on by the overwhelming sadness of the town. But then, it happened again and again. Could the spirits of the children still linger in the house, caught between life and death? Or was something more malevolent at play here? Had the Everly children vanished before the fire ever started, taken by something beyond human comprehension? And if they were taken, who took them and why? As the days stretched into weeks, Rose's obsession with finding answers only grew. She stopped leaving the house, her eyes becoming darker with each passing hour. Jonathan, helpless and broken, could no longer reach her. She would stand by the window, her gaze locked on the woods, waiting for a sign, something, anything, that would prove her children were still alive. She wasn't the only one obsessed. More and more people in the town became fixated on the mystery, trying to piece together a story that didn't make sense. There were still questions that no one could answer. Why hadn't the children been found? Why did no one see them leave the house? And why had the fire left nothing behind but smoldering wreckage? Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each day bringing more rumors, more speculation, and more unanswered questions. And still, no one could shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Could the fire have been set to destroy evidence of a darker truth? Or had the children been taken by someone or something that no one could explain? As weeks turned to months, the whispers grew louder. Some said it was the house itself that held the answers. The Everly house had always felt different, as though it were watching, as though it held secrets too terrible to reveal. Others couldn't shake the growing suspicion that the fire had never been an accident. Could someone have orchestrated it? Could someone have wanted the children gone for reasons they refused to speak of? Was there something about the family, something about their past, that had made them a target? Rose and Jonathan continued to drift apart. The weight of the mystery, the unanswered questions, seemed to tear them apart. Jonathan, though he searched every inch of the property, found no evidence of what had really happened. The woods surrounding the house remained silent, as though they too were hiding something. And Rose had become a shell of the woman she once was. Her eyes, once filled with warmth, were now empty, haunted. The ghost of her children was all she could think about. She knew, deep down, they were out there somewhere, waiting for her. But where? Some nights, when the wind howled through the trees, she would stand by the window, trembling, waiting for the faint sound of a child's voice, the soft rustle of a footstep, anything that would tell her they were still alive. But it never came. The house was silent. The truth had become a dark puzzle, pieces scattered to the wind, and with every unanswered question, the mystery grew more unbearable. What really happened to the Everly children? Were they ever truly lost? Or were they the victims of something much darker than anyone dared to believe? And as time marched on, the clock kept ticking. As the investigation stalled, the town's unease began to fester, twisting its way into the hearts of those who had once believed in the certainty of everyday life. It wasn't just the Everlys who were tormented by the unknown. Everyone was. Each passing day seemed to taunt the very fabric of reality, leaving only more questions and more unsettling thoughts. People whispered in hushed tones, "Where are they now? What happened to those children?" But no one had an answer. Not one that made any sense anyway. No clues, no bodies, no clear explanation. But there were the whispers. The soft, low murmurs from neighbors who claimed to have seen shadows moving inside the Everly house long after the fire had consumed it. The odd figures that appeared at the windows at dusk, standing just out of view, the rumors about the unexplainable sounds, the ones that grew louder as the sun set, when the world seemed to fall into stillness. One night, as Rose wandered through the charred remnants of her home, the silence pressed down on her like a weight. She could feel it, something watching her, something waiting. It was then that she heard it, a soft voice calling her name. Her children's voices. Was she hearing things? Could it be her mind breaking under the grief? Or was it real? The thought gnawed at her as she stood frozen, heart pounding, listening to the wind. But the voices stopped. The house stood in ruin, yet it felt alive, waiting, watching. In that moment, Rose knew. She knew that the truth was not just hidden in the past. It was here, now, in the house, in the very walls she had once loved. And that feeling, the one that told her to leave the house forever, to run, to never look back, was the same feeling that kept her rooted in place. There was no escape. Not from the house, not from the memories, not from the children she refused to believe were gone forever. She pressed on, determined to uncover what had really happened. What if the fire was just a cover-up? What if the children had been taken? Before the flames, before the destruction, the clock was ticking. Every hour that passed, every day that stretched into an unending nightmare, added a new layer of confusion, of fear. Were they alive? Were they trapped somewhere, waiting for someone to find them? Or had they been taken by someone who had come to the town, someone who knew exactly what they were doing? But why? Why these children? Jonathan's obsession with finding answers had become just as consuming. He couldn't sit still. He couldn't sleep. He spent every waking moment piecing together the fragments, the broken clues that no one else cared about. The fire, the strange circumstances, the conflicting reports. And then there were the footprints, small ones that appeared in the dirt around the house after the fire had burned out. But no one could explain them. Not the investigators, not the neighbors, not even Jonathan. There was one footprint, one print near the woods, too strange to ignore. It was the print of a child's shoe, but it wasn't like the others. It was new, fresh, and yet no one had seen any children near the site after the fire. No one except Jonathan. He was the one who found the tracks, and he was the one who followed them. The path led him deeper into the woods, through the darkening trees, until he reached a clearing. There, in the middle of the forest, stood something unsettling. A small wooden structure, old, decaying, but unmistakably there. The structure was an abandoned shed, but it looked like no shed Jonathan had ever seen. There were symbols carved into the walls, strange, indecipherable markings. He was too afraid to enter. His gut told him to turn back, to forget what he had found. But he couldn't. He opened the door. Inside there was nothing at first, just a darkness. But then through the shadows he saw something, a small, abandoned toy. His heart stopped. It was one of his children's toys. He recognized it immediately. How had it ended up here, and why? As Jonathan reached for the toy, a cold wind swept through the trees, and the door slammed shut behind him. A low, haunting whisper echoed from the dark corners of the shed. "Leave. Leave now." Jonathan's heart raced. The room seemed to close in around him. He spun around, but there was no one there. No children, no answers, only the suffocating darkness. In that moment, Jonathan knew one thing for certain. He was not alone. The question remained, who or what was really responsible for the children's disappearance, and what secrets lay hidden in the forest, in the shed, in the house they once called home? The clock was ticking. The walls were closing in, and the answers were just out of reach. But they were closer than ever. Do you believe the Everly children were taken before the fire? Or is something else at play here? Could something supernatural have been involved? Something none of us could ever explain? What would you do if you were Jonathan or Rose? What would you ask? Share your thoughts below. Together, maybe we can find the answers that no one else has been able to uncover. Time is running out, and the truth is waiting. The hours stretched on, each minute heavier than the last, as Jonathan sat alone in the shed, the toy clenched in his shaking hand. The shadows danced around him like specters, mocking his every thought. Every time he moved, it felt like the room grew smaller, tighter. The walls seemed to whisper with an almost malicious glee. Was it a trick of his mind, or was something truly in that darkness? He had to know. He stepped forward, inching toward the corner where the shadows seemed the deepest. The air felt colder now, unnatural, as if it carried something much older, something far darker. Suddenly, a faint scratching sound echoed from the far end of the shed. Jonathan froze, his breath catching in his throat. Was it an animal, or something else? His instincts screamed at him to leave, to run. But the mystery of his children's disappearance was too much. His feet moved before he could stop them. He rounded the corner, and there, lying in the dirt, was a piece of cloth, tattered, stained with what looked like ash, but unmistakably from a child's dress. It didn't make sense. If the fire had consumed everything, why was this piece of clothing here, untouched by the flames? But the questions kept coming. Did the children ever burn? Were they taken before the fire? Or had something kept them alive long after the flames had faded? And then, just as he bent down to inspect the cloth, he heard it. The unmistakable sound of a child's laugh. Soft, high-pitched, and chilling. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But Jonathan's heart was hammering. He couldn't bring himself to stand up. He couldn't leave. It was as if something held him in place, paralyzing him, drawing him further into the madness. Mom? Dad? The voice was barely a whisper, but it was there, clear as day. He couldn't see anything. He couldn't hear anything but the laugh, and now, a voice, pleading, calling for help. He reached out for the voice, but the air grew thick with a suffocating pressure, as if something was pulling him under, dragging him deeper into the darkness. And then, just as quickly, the voice stopped. The room fell silent again. Jonathan, gasping for breath, looked around the shed, panic rising. The toys, the clothing, the laughter, it all felt so wrong, like some twisted game, but one that was never meant to be played, and yet here he was. Still holding the cloth in his hand, his fingers trembling, he made a decision. He couldn't leave without answers. It wasn't just the children, it was everything. The fire, the symbols, the whispers, the missing pieces. Everything pointed to something more than just a tragic accident. But what was it? Could the fire have been a cover-up? Was there something much worse going on? Something buried beneath the ashes? Or was there an even more chilling explanation? Was someone or something still watching them, still keeping their children hidden? The questions plagued Jonathan, his mind unable to settle on any one theory. Could he really trust his own thoughts after everything he had witnessed? Could anyone? As he left the shed, the weight of what he'd found, or hadn't found, hung over him like a cloud, suffocating, blinding him from seeing the truth. The toy in his hand felt heavier now. Was it a clue, a warning, or was it all a figment of his shattered mind? The fire that destroyed the Everly home may have stolen the physical traces of the children, but their disappearance still lingers in the hearts and minds of all who knew them. What happened to Sarah, Thomas, Emily, Jacob, and Lily? Did they vanish before the flames ever reached their doorstep? Or had they been trapped by something far more insidious? The truth is closer than we think, but will we ever find it? Or will the answers remain buried in the very ashes of the house itself? If you have any insights or theories on this case, please share them in the comments below. Could the fire have been the key to understanding their fate? Or is there something else at play? Join the discussion. Let's see if we can uncover the pieces of this chilling puzzle together. Subscribe to stay updated on this case and other unsolved mysteries that might finally hold the key to the Everly children's fate.